This is episode 11 of Ionia, and for this episode I decided to invite Joe Schmid to join me as my guest co-host. Before we get into it, Joe, do you want to talk a bit about yourself and the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, thank you for having me on here. I'm really excited for this. So I study philosophy at Purdue University, and I do both scholarly and popular level work in philosophy. So on the scholarly level, I write and publish papers in peer-reviewed journals. And on the popular level, I make lecture videos and host discussions on my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. I've had lots of really cool philosophers on, and I also run a blog by the same name, Majesty of Reason.
Now, today, the topic is really special to me. Not only has my guest accepted the good news, his work is always good news. He is one of the most influential Christian thinkers and the foremost defender of Christianity. He has published more than 180 articles and authored and edited over 24 books, and his work has been translated to more than 20 languages. His latest book asks us, are we bodies or souls? And in other good news, he answers in the affirmative. Thank you, Professor Richard Swinburne, for joining us.
My pleasure, my pleasure. The affirmative was to the first half of the disjunction. We are souls.
Having mentioned the good news, I think we should kind of get on to the introduction of the whole position, since the book is focused on substance dualism.
Yeah.
So let's start with the first question. What do you mean by substance?
Well, a substance is a thing, a constituent of the universe or the universe itself. It's such a general term that it's best illustrated by examples. My table is a substance, the earth is a substance, disembodied spirits are substances if they exist. Anything that has properties but isn't an event, but whose having those properties constitutes an event, is a substance. I think that's a fairly clear notion. Substances can consist of other substances. The desk can consist of a top and a number of drawers and so on. That's what substances are. They're things that have properties, and they have properties at particular times. And so if the soul is a substance, it has properties.
Yeah, so that kind of bridges us into the mind or the soul and asking sort of what that consists in. So can you give us a rundown of what you mean by mind or soul, as you use the word?
I avoided the word mind. I explicitly said I would avoid the word mind because it's used in so many vague senses. Soul, well, that too is used in a number of senses, but it's used in a pretty clear sense, both by Plato and Descartes, and also by a lot of ordinary people. To me, a substance which is a part of me, but is not a physical part, and not an extended part, that's to say it doesn't have a certain volume, it's what makes me me, or rather substance dualism is the view that it's an essential part of me. Without it, I wouldn't be me. And the particular form of substance dualism that I'm defending is that it's the only essential part of me. Substance dualism may hold, as it were, both bodies and souls are essential, and in a certain sense Aquinas held that, but Descartes held, and I hold, that the soul is the one and only essential part of me. Though of course I do have another part, my body and all that it's made of, but that's not essential for it being me. That's the doctrine.
The reason for writing the book, now it seems to me that the most common complaint I receive from dualists is that the treatment of dualism is kind of summed up in textbook interactions and then left off at that. So was there any particular reason, like reaching out to a more public audience in writing the book? Why another book on dualism?
Yes. Well, I have written quite a bit about dualism before, you're quite right. And in some ways, what I have to say here are on basically the same view, but I've added some details, some further arguments, and also I intended it as a more popular book. That's to say, my last book in this area, Mind, Brain and Free Will, was only one that really a professional philosopher could come to grips with. But I wanted this to have a wider audience. I'm not certain I've altogether succeeded in that, but it has succeeded in making it as accessible to the general public as I would like, but I think it is more accessible than Mind, Brain and Free Will, and I wanted that. And so to make it more accessible, to tighten up the arguments in certain ways, to spell them out a little more clearly, and to make several further points. For example, I've never discussed Descartes before, and I have a chapter saying why I think basically Descartes was right, and that's worth saying because it's a pretty unpopular view. And so those were my motivations.
Right. So just one thing for those of you, dear Persian listeners who are listening, and just to play our part, keep yourself posted on the news of the translation of Richard's latest book, so you could be part of the general public that would become aware of his thinking too. So with that, let's move on to the arguments for dualism. Joe, do you want...
You kindly mentioned that you had in mind to translate this book, and I did send you a number of corrections. Those corrections were not corrections to the argument. They were meant to make it more comprehensible than the English language version. And so your audience will have a better chance, a slightly better chance of coming to grips with it. Right, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to basically roughly articulate it and then ask you for clarifications or additions. So the divisibility argument, or, some people call it the modal argument, you can roughly understand it as it is conceivable that one's mind might exist without one's body. Any material thing, or at least any that is a candidate for being a thinker, is divisible into parts. But no thinking thing could be divided into parts. The very idea of half a thinker or half a mind seems to be absurd. Thinkers, ourselves included, must therefore be simple and hence immaterial. So that's kind of Ashkan's summary that I was just kind of articulating there. Do you have any clarifications or additions, Richard, for the audience?
No, but I think I can explain why it's inconceivable, as it were. This is an argument against partial identity. I think we ought to go back one stage, that is to say, almost all the attempts to deal with the problem of what makes a person at one time the same person as a person at a later time say that, well, it's a matter of bodily continuity, or having some of the bodily parts of the earlier person, and mental continuity, being able to remember some of the things that the earlier person did. And the immediate problem is how much of these things. It's entirely arbitrary, and it looks as if any analysis on those lines would be arbitrary. Why 50% of the body rather than 20% or 80% and so And also there is the problem that if you have slightly low standards, that is to say, the later person has to have 40% of the body in order to be the same person. Well, there could be another later person that had 40% in there, and they can't both be the same. So at that point, the more fashionable view these days is what I call a partial identity theory. That is to say, identity of persons is a matter of degree. Later persons are somewhat the same as earlier persons, but not entirely. And this view is very fashionable. Parfit, Nozick, and others have adopted it. And initially it might sound a bit plausible, but it runs into big problems. And the big problems are really the ones that you originally alluded to. Okay, well, if partial identity is possible, then it ought to be possible to divide a person into two so that, at any rate, in some respects, in some bodily respects, there are two people, one of whom has some of the body and some of the thoughts, and the other of which has the other part of the body and the other of the thoughts. And indeed, for any theory of personal identity, that must be the case, that it is possible to set that up, because unless you require 100% continuity, there will always be the possibility of partial continuity. Right? So, if somebody, and I call this person, what did I call this person? Alexandra, is divided into two, or rather her brain is divided into two, and half is put into one body, and we call that Alex, and the other is put into another body, and we call that Sandra. And the suggestion is both of these persons are partly identical to the earlier Alexandra. Now, what does that consist in? What is it for them to be partially identical? Well, after the analogy of material objects, if you use a table to make two tables, and you use the top to make one table and the drawers to make another, then each of the persons would have part of the Alexandra, and that would mean part of her brain and perhaps part of her memories. Right. And so there would be these two persons, both of whom are partly Alexandra. Now, what would it mean for them both to be partly Alexandra? Well, if Alexandra knows in advance what's going to happen, Alexandra can reasonably expect that, at any rate, to some degree, she will have all of the experiences of each of them. Otherwise, there wouldn't be. And one of them may be horrific experiences. She knows that Sandra is going to have some horrific experiences, and she knows that Alex is going to have some marvelous experiences, so she can expect to have mixed experiences. But of course no one person does have mixed experiences, so that can't be what partial identity consists in. Well, perhaps it consists in part of Alexandra having one of the experiences, and part of Alexandra having another of the experiences. But that entails that the original Alexandra has two parts who each have different experiences, or they may be sort of qualitatively identical experiences, but there are two parts in the original Alexandra, one of whom can go one way and the other can go the other way. But that's just not the case. Each of us has only one part, in the sense that all our different mental events are co-experienced. I experience seeing you, I experience hearing a noise out of the window, I experience touching the desk and so on. There's just one source here. And so there isn't a part of me that can go one way, and a different part that can go another way. There's only one me. So I can't give any sense to it being the case that a later person can be partially identical with an earlier person. And therefore, if I'm right about this, therefore it will follow that one of the people, at least one of the people, sorry, at most one of the people, possibly neither, but at most one of the people can be the earlier person. And yet, being the earlier person doesn't consist in having some of the same body or some of the same mental events, because that becomes arbitrary where you draw the line. And the only reasonable thing to say at this point is the more some later person has of the original person's brain, and the more the later person has of the original person's memories, the more probable it is that that person is the earlier person. But being the earlier person doesn't consist in having a certain proportion. You run into those difficulties. And therefore, being the earlier person is something over and beyond what the evidence is. And the evidence is brain continuity and memory continuity. And that's the way that the argument goes.
All right, Ashkan, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that pretty much the force of the argument relies on a kind of neo-Lockean view of persistence of persons during time. And that takes psychological continuity to be essential. So what are your thoughts if we, for example, regard biology as Eric Olson does to be what tells us what happens during these cases that, people, for example, or their left hemisphere or their right hemisphere is moved. So we would be animals in that sense, organisms. And when the another person receives my left hemisphere or my right hemisphere, I would be still me, but they just receive a part of this organism, like a liver transplant, for example. So what are your thoughts on, for example, animalism? Do you think this will change things?
Well, animalism, as Eric Olson puts it sometimes, is we are human animals. Now, of course, I don't want to deny that. At any rate, for us on Earth, we are human animals. But the question is, because we've all got bodies, what makes us who we are? What makes us that particular person? And well, we certainly do need more than the body. If the person's dead, but the body is still working, that's not the person. A dead person isn't a person.
So being a person, would be contingent, but the animal would be persisting. So, for example, when someone is in a vegetative state, they do not have any mental activities, any psychological continuity, but they are still that person, right?
Well, maybe not. If by degrees of vegetative state, but if you mean by vegetative state that connected to that body and that brain there are no conscious events, no mental life, then it seems to me it's a bit of a matter of arbitrary, a borderline case, a bit of a matter of arbitrary definition, whether there's a person there or not. If there's a person there, it's certainly the original person there. But if there's a person there, it must be revivable. If it's not revivable, then the person's dead. Once again, what counts as revivable is a little borderline. Nothing turns on that. I mean, if you say it must be revivable in a certain way, and they're not revival in that way, but then a bit later they're conscious again. You can say either, well, he was there all the time, but it needed certain things to revive him, or you can say he died and we brought him to life again. It's pretty arbitrary what you say in that regard. After all, when we're asleep in a dreamless sleep, we don't consider that the person has disappeared, but that's because it's easy to wake them up. And because we have reason to believe, because of their particular brain states, that from time to time they do have conscious experiences. But if that's all gone, and if it's not possible to revive, then the person's gone. And if suddenly bits of the brain come to life again, then the question arises, well, is it the same person or not? And once again, you weigh the evidence.
All right. So I think at this point we might just want to shift gears, and I want to touch on an issue that's related to a lot of these kind of modal arguments for dualism. That So the point that I want to touch on is called mitigated modal skepticism. So this will take some spelling out, so I'll do that, and then I'll get to my question. So many philosophers.
Van Inwagen.
Yes. So many, I was just about to say that. So many philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen, Philippe Elion, and so on, they've defended a view that has come to be called mitigated modal skepticism. And the view kind of pertains to the scope of our modal knowledge, that is, our knowledge of metaphysical possibility and necessity. And in particular, and roughly, the view essentially says that a significant degree of skepticism or intellectual humility, if you want to put it in a kind of more positive light, is called for when it comes to possibility claims in domains that are far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience. So defenders of the view, they have a variety of motivations for this kind of view. So I just want to, for the listeners, spell out briefly four. So first, as Kripke and others have taught us, many metaphysical necessities are only knowable through experience and like scientific investigation, right? Like we just simply can't access such modal facts from our favorite armchair via imagination or conception. And given that there are many such hidden necessities, as it were, it seems, so these people argue, the mitigated modal skepticist, it seems that we should not be confident that conceived or imagined scenarios beyond our humdrum experience do not involve hidden metaphysical impossibilities. So that's one kind of motivation. A second motivation is that many, if not most, imagined or conceived scenarios that are even modestly removed from our ordinary humdrum experience are such that when we flesh out the details, they come to be, or when we flesh out the details, we come to see that they are metaphysically impossible, or it's not clear whether they are metaphysically impossible. So, for instance, a lot of these people say that, I can conceive or imagine of an iron bar floating on water, say. But given the densities involved and given the nature of iron and water that we discover a posteriori, that's simply metaphysically impossible. So that's the second kind of argument. A third kind of argument is that they say that a kind of permissive, freewheeling approach to modal judgments about possibilities admits of way too many false positives. So, they could say, what about Goldbach's conjecture? So these people argue we apparently can be able to conceive of both its truth or its falsehood, or at least a successful proof of its truth or its falsehood. Similarly with the modal ontological argument for a necessary being and the reverse modal ontological argument, which have incompatible but equally well conceivable or imaginable possibility premises. Moreover, some people might say, we can conceive of ourselves existing without our brain, but also we might be able to conceive of ourselves being identical to our brain. And since identity is necessary, the possibility claims involved would seem to be incompatible. So that's a third motivation. And then finally, very, very briefly, some authors argue that there's little to no explanatory connection between modal facts way beyond our humdrum experience and our beliefs about said facts, and that this lack of explanatory connection kind of undermines our claims to knowledge in these domains. So, for instance, Timothy Williamson, I believe, and also Nichols, they both argue that the ability to reason about nearby but not remote possibilities is conducive to our survival in virtue of giving us the ability to evaluate risks and opportunities, for instance, by mentally simulating counterfactual scenarios. So with these kind of motivations sketched and with the mitigated modal skepticism in mind, Richard, how do your kind of arguments for dualism engage with this mitigated modal skepticism? Like, do you think it poses a serious challenge to many modal arguments for dualism, or do you think this challenge can be like overcome?
Well, skepticism is easy. One can be skeptical about absolutely anything. The question is whether it's rational to be skeptical. I am prepared to admit that I may be wrong about almost anything except, as Descartes said, my own existence and my current thinking. And so, of course, for that sort of reason, I may be wrong about this. But by reasonable standards of whether one is right or wrong, I think I've got a good argument and nobody's got a better argument by a long way for the other side. Right. But in order to deal with your point at length, we're going to take up quite a bit of this debate, and I'm quite willing to do that, but I'll just explain to you why. It all depends, or a lot depends, on what you understand by metaphysical possibility. When I was young, there was only one kind of really hard possibility, and that was usually called logical possibility. And a sentence or the proposition which it expressed was logically possible if and only if it didn't entail a contradiction, and it was necessary if its negation entailed a contradiction, it was impossible if it entails a contradiction. And this, whether it entailed a contradiction or not, was something that if you understood the sentence, you could start working out. And of course, there may be a hidden contradiction, as perhaps, though I'm not so sure about that, your iron argument suggested. There may be a hidden contradiction somewhere. But with regard to a lot of sentences, it's pretty obvious whether they do or don't entail contradictions. And so we have a lot of a priori knowledge of what's logically possible and what isn't logically possible. And we know how to set about discovering whether something's possible or not. You discover whether it's necessary by seeing if its negation entails a contradiction, and conversely, to show it's possible requires a little more effort. And the usual way of showing that some sentence is logically possible is by seeing whether you can sketch a scenario in which that sentence would be true. In other words, whether you can suggest a fairly obvious logical possibility which entails that sentence. And that, of course, is what I am giving you an a priori argument for it being, for some of these matters, some of these matters. Now, then, Kripke and Putnam came along, and they said, there are some necessities as hard and as logical necessities, only you can't work it out by merely knowing words. And that exists because things have hidden essences, and the essences make them what they are. And if you don't know what the hidden essence is, then you will say that something is so-and-so, and it may not be because its hidden essence is different. And the famous sort of examples given, I'm sorry to go through this, but it is necessary. Those sort of examples famously given is water. Putnam's example. You see something as, we pick out things as water because they are, it's a liquid in our seas, or most of our seas and rivers, and it's transparent and drinkable, and that's how we pick it out as water. But, says Putnam, what makes it water isn't all this, it's what it's made of that is to say, molecules of H2O. And for that reason, we may sometimes misidentify something as water, or we while it is in fact necessary that water is H2O, although we can't, people before the 19th century didn't realize this. So there are necessities arising from the essences of things. Okay, but these are a posteriori metaphysical necessities. Right. Now, what's the relation between these necessities and logical necessities? Well, I think it's a very simple one, and that's this. The supposed metaphysical necessity, water is H2O, is equivalent to a logical necessity and its conjunction with a logically contingent proposition. The logically necessary principle is something like kinds of liquid are the liquid they are in virtue of their chemical essence. Well, okay, you can define kinds of liquid that way if you want. People have generally done so. And the contingent proposition is the properties of being transparent and being drinkable and being found in our rivers, and seas are contingently produced by molecules of H2O. That might not be true, but it is true. And so that's what makes it metaphysically necessary. And I have developed a more general theory of this matter when we are dealing with what I call underlying essence, metaphysical necessities, that is to say, water is really H2O because of its underlying essence. Then something is metaphysically necessary or possible or impossible if and only if when you substitute for the referring expressions in the sentence, what I call informative designators for what I call uninformative designators, you get a logically necessary sentence. I'm sorry to go on this, but it's, So, what do I mean by an informative designator? An informative designator is one such that if you know what it means, you know what it refers to. An uninformative designator is if you know what it means, you don't necessarily know what it refers to. The tallest person in the room, the highest building in London, these are uninformative designators, but you can understand them perfectly, yet not know who is the tallest building. On the other hand, many of the property words for picking out properties, observable properties, are informative designators. For something to be square is for something to have this shape, and you can see it. To be spherical, for something to be a door, it has to be like this, and when you push it, does this, in other words, opened it. You wouldn't know what a door was unless you could recognize it in this way. You wouldn't know what spherical was unless you could recognize it in this way. And there are also names of individual things like this. the Eiffel Tower, you wouldn't know what that was unless you could recognize it when you see it. Or rather, I then have to qualify. Something is an informative designator if and only if you can recognize when something is or isn't it, if your faculties are working properly, if you are properly positioned, and if you are not subject to deception. And subject to deception is a matter of something looking not the way it normally looks in paradigm circumstances. So, of course, someone may think they're looking at a square when really they're not, because they're looking from a distance, or their eyes aren't working properly, or there's some trick of the light or so on. But nevertheless, and likewise with the Eiffel Tower or London or whatever, sure, somebody can make a mock-up of London and try and pretend it's London, or a mock-up of the Eiffel Tower, and that's deceptive. But given that your faculties are working properly and so on, you'll recognize it. Okay, so applying that back to the Waters H2O example, and I should say something is, just to repeat my definition, an informative designator if and only if, under ideal conditions, you can recognize whether it's a case of it or not, with your faculties are working properly and you're ideally positioned, or it's defined in terms of other words of which that is true. All right? Now, water is H2O. Water is clearly, for the reasons we've already got into, not an informative designator. You can call something water and be badly misinformed, even though your faculties are working properly and so on and so forth. But H2O is an informative designator in my sense, because although we can't, as it were, our eyes aren't quite the right sort to spot it straight off. Nevertheless, the definition is in terms of things that are ultimately informative designators. It's made of molecules, each of which are made of 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. An atom of hydrogen is defined as one which has 1 proton in its nucleus, and oxygen is defined as something that has 8 protons in its nucleus. Protons are very small particles, proton is defined in terms of its mass and in terms of its charge, and it's 10 to the minus 15 of something, and 10 to the minus 15 is defined in terms of 10, 1/10, 15 times, and so on. You can get a definition ultimately in terms of things you can recognize. Okay, so my contention is, and I have began to argue that in 1 or 2 papers, including initially, of course, Mind, Brain and Free Will, and also in an appendix to Chapter 5 of this book, Are We Bodies or Souls? But it's very important for understanding those metaphysical propositions which are of the underlying essence kind, that if you substitute for them for the referring expressions of properties or substances in them, any uninformative designators, and you substitute co-referring informative designators, you get a priori, that is logically necessary propositions. And Okay. Well, so there's nothing deeply mysterious about metaphysical necessity of that sort. On the other hand, of course, philosophy has taken off in a direction very strange to what I was used to as an undergraduate. People are postulating all sorts of wild metaphysical necessities. The world is absolutely full of these things, and they are not a priori, but they detect, they force the world to have a certain shape, and they're just as necessary as a priori ones. And I see no reason in general to believe that at all. This is just wild philosophical speculation. I can understand these the ones of the sort I've talked about because you can understand what you're saying there by saying it's metaphysically necessary. It is that the substance you in fact pick out by water has a certain characteristic. Okay, I can understand that. And all the other ones, all the chemical ones, or Hesperus, phosphorus, they all fall into the same pattern. So I'm happy with that. I don't see any reason to believe there are any other sorts. And given all that, then when we come back to are we bodies or souls, my ultimate contention is, of course, that the word I, or my own proper names referring to me, is an informative designator. And so, and not merely in virtue of being defined, but in virtue of my ability to recognize myself in ideal circumstances. That is to say, when I'm a subject of conscious thoughts. And that being so, we've got the proposition I am now thinking, or I am now the same person as such and such a later person. There's no deep metaphysical necessity here of a sort we can't detect, because all the referring expressions are informative designators. Either it's a priori possible or whatever, or it isn't. And that's the only sort of metaphysical possibility it can hold. So that, though I've gone on rather a long time, I hope this has been comprehensible, is my answer to the Van Inwagen scenario. He's right that some of the things that philosophers suggest might be logically necessary, and for all we know, ... couldn't be might be metaphysically necessary for all we know what, couldn't be metaphysically necessary in this sense, and I see no reason to believe that anything is metaphysically necessary unless we can show it in this sort of way. So, we've taken up a lot of time on that, but that is the move. And it is very important, actually, because a lot of wild speculation around is open to criticism on those lines. We simply couldn't understand some of these things.
Awesome. Thank you for the answer. Definitely useful. One other thing which dualism focuses on is its explanatory power. So imagine knowing all your information that you want to have of your interactions of physical properties. But when someone asks you, okay, could you explain consciousness for me? You might draw a blank. So one of the advantages of dualism is argued to be its advantageous fact in explanatory virtues. So, Joe, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So, you were pinpointing some potential explanatory advantages of dualism in accounting for, mental phenomena that seem distinct at least from the kind of particles bashing into one another or excitations of quantum fields and whatnot. So that's what a lot of dualists say might be explanatory advantages of substance dualism. But my question now might be a potential explanatory disadvantage of substance dualism at some physicalists level. And that is, of course, the potential tension with conservation laws. And so this will probably be the last thing that we cover for our discussion. But so on this Well, I guess the basic problem is that, hey, given our conservation laws, it seems as though energy cannot be created or destroyed. And moreover, if we take conservation of momentum laws, it would seem as though the brain and the various momenta of the particles and neurons and neurotransmitters and so on, it would seem as though you have a complete and sufficient a kind of physical explanation of that, because there's no room for a kind of impetus or insertion of either energy or momentum or change of direction or any of these sorts of things from without, from outside the physical system in question. And so they argue that might potentially violate, dualism that is, might potentially violate these conservation laws. Now, I know you address this, Richard, in your book, but philosopher David Gunn, I think that's his name, I think that's how you pronounce it, in a recent 2021 article entitled On the Ultimate Origination of Things in Philosopher's Imprint, he defends a kind of conservation type argument against substance dualism. And so I just want to briefly spell out his exposition of the argument. And then he also addresses what you, Richard, say. So I kind of just want to get your take for the final thing that we do in our discussion. I want to get your take on his response to your response. Okay, so here is a brief quotation wherein he spells out the kind of the problem. Okay, so I'm quoting from pages 8 to 9. It's just one paragraph. Newton's second law of motion states that the change in the linear momentum of a body is proportional to the force impressed upon it, while his third law states that for every impressed force, there is another force of this kind, which is equal in magnitude but opposite in direction to the first. It follows that the change in momentum induced by the first force is equal in magnitude but opposite in sign to the change in momentum induced by its reciprocal complement, and so on for every pair of reciprocal impressed forces. In other words, these two changes exactly counterbalance one another, so that there is no overall change in linear momentum. The total quantity of rectilinear motion is therefore conserved, which is what we set out to show. An analogous dynamical argument holds for curvilinear motion. That dynamics enables us to explain the conservation of the total quantity of motion in a merely physical way, implies that there could be no immaterial contribution to this quantity, contrary to substance dualism. Okay, so that's his quotation. And so he then goes on to consider your response to conservation type arguments. So this is, again, just one more paragraph I'm going to read. This is his response. So Gunn says, in his recent defense of substance dualism, Swinburne, 2013, pages 112 to 115, attempts to circumvent conservation arguments from classical physics by claiming that in quantum physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle implies that the conservation laws hold not strictly but only statistically. However, as we shall indicate, analogous theoretical demonstrations showing that the conservation laws hold strictly also in modern field theories, including those of quantum physics, reveal that Swinburne is mistaken on this point. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle pertains to the appearance or measurement of physical things, as Swinburne acknowledges. But if the uncertainties it denotes are to make room for the interaction between material and immaterial substance that he envisages, they really need to pertain to physical things as they exist in themselves, something that the conservation laws, strictly obtaining, and the deterministic evolution of the wave function preclude. End quote. So I'm wondering what your assessment of Gunn's critical engagement with your response to conservation type arguments against substance dualism.
All that I need to invoke at this point is not substance dualism, but property dualism. There are conscious thoughts. The world consists of them. And there are sensations and thoughts and intentions and beliefs and so on. They happen. They happen more obviously than the physical world happens. And pretty clearly, a lot of them are caused or partly caused by goings on in the brain. So, and also it's pretty obvious that no physical theory has the slightest ability, as things are at the moment, to explain why that is the case. So no physical theory can possibly be complete. So it's no good appealing to a physical theory to show anything in this area. Because it's so manifest that it can't deal with these things. It's so manifest that going on in the brain does cause pain and does cause somebody to have a certain belief and so on. And given that, things have effects. Clearly things in the brain have effects other than the effects which are a matter of more particles colliding with each other. And since it goes one way, there's no reason to suppose it wouldn't go the other way, or couldn't go the other way. Even if you were right that the brain is a deterministic system, the way it would have to work would be that the brain caused some pain or whatever, and simultaneously cause some other going on. And so it wouldn't be really, as it were, the pain that caused the going on, it would be the brain event. And of course, some physicalists do adopt that view. But firstly, it doesn't seem like it. We agonize about a decision, we take the decision, we put it into operation. It looks like there's a downward causal route from our thoughts and feelings to the motion of our hands, and clearly we don't affect the motion of our hands directly. It must be through the brain, so down to the brain. But then, of course, the physicalist comes along and say, oh, but that's only an illusion. Now, the argument in chapter 6 of my book is that you could never show it's an illusion except by presupposing it to be true, because what would be the evidence that there's no downward causation, that our pains never make a difference to whether we scream or not? Well, you would have to find out that whether we scream or not, we had to find out whether a certain brain sequence will produce pain, both when we have a pain and when we don't. Sorry, produce screaming both when we have a pain and when we don't. And how would you show that? Well, you would show that by showing that by finding cases where we have a pain and it doesn't by finding cases that it happens both when we do have a pain and when we don't have a pain. But for that purpose, we have to know, the experimenter has to know who's checking this out when the subject is having a pain. And how is he going to know that? Well, the subject tells him he has a pain, but the subject can only convey information to him if the subject's belief that he intends the words to come out of his mouth and causes them to come out of his mouth. And so more generally, I mean, I have a general argument of that they couldn't, whether any attempt to any reliance on memory that this has happened would presuppose a downward causation from the mental to the physical and so on. So more generally, you could only prove that the mental life didn't affect the physical life by some sort of demonstration which presupposed that it did. And since it seems that it does, and since nobody could show that it doesn't, it's reasonable to suppose it does. And so it's reasonable to suppose not merely that there's an upward move from brain to mental life, as obviously there is, but that there's a downward move. Now, that means that there are all sorts of laws governing this. This brain event produces this mental event, that mental event produces this brain event. And physics doesn't include those laws. So there's no point in appealing to physics in this area. It's clearly got enormous deficiencies, and so leave it aside.
So while I love to continue, unfortunately this is all the time we had.
wait a moment, before you go, even though the hour's up, I don't feel we got on to my central arguments there in any sense. My central arguments were that given that I is an informative designator, I can know what I am talking about when I say that I am thinking, or I know this, and so on. And it is manifest that this doesn't entail a contradiction. I can see that it's true. And it is manifest also that I am the same person as the person earlier doesn't entail a contradiction, because I know what I'm talking about. And that being the case, I can conceive, as Descartes said, but in fact there isn't a physical world, I'm only dreaming, and I can see there's no contradiction in this, and therefore it cannot be necessary for my existence. It can't be logically necessary, and therefore it can't be metaphysically necessary because it's an informative designator. It can't be metaphysically necessary for my existence that I have a body. And if we alter the thought experiment slightly, I can conceive not merely that there isn't a physical world and I don't have a body, but I can conceive that I have a body and I gradually lose control of it. Now, this could only be the case. This requires, because I lose control of it, that having a soul is necessary, but it also requires that having the soul is sufficient, because it shows that having a soul is sufficient, because if I don't have a body, I still have it. But it also shows that having a soul is necessary, because if I didn't have a soul at the first point, when I am in fact in control of my body, then there wouldn't be any continuity between me when I have my body and me when I don't have my body, because at first there's the body and then there's the soul, and therefore there wouldn't be the same person, because there would be no continuity. So in order for there to be the same person, something must continue, and if it isn't the body, then it must be the soul. So it makes sense. There is no contradiction in supposing, and that shows that logically all that is necessary for my existence is a soul and not a body. Now, forgive me extending it beyond the time that I said, but I'm afraid we got rather... I wonder whether I was wise to start on informative designators, but it's pretty central to my argument, and therefore that's how it is. But I did want to make this this crucial point, since this is what the book's all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm glad we got into that stuff, because our listeners love to get into like the details and the nitty gritty of the philosophy. So I'm actually really glad we got to do that. So Ashkan, do you have a final word?
We shared the good news, folks, with you. Now it's your decision to weigh up the evidence and make up your mind. Thank you. And thank you, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest.